When I was asked to go on a trip to Iraq, my instinct was to say no. As much as I wanted to go, Steve, I felt, well, what can I give? I don't want to go there and I'm just assuming people know who I am. I don't have an act. I'm not a stand-up comedian. I don't have a show. I would feel like an asshole.
You are listening to The Wisdom Project, a podcast produced by the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History in the University of Kentucky Libraries. I'm Doug Boyd. Steve Zahn is one of those actors you almost certainly recognize. Steve has been working steadily in film and television for more than 3 decades, sometimes in big studio films, sometimes in small independent projects. His filmography is extensive. A few jump out to me: War for the Planet of the Apes, Dallas Buyers Club, Crimson Tide, Sahara, Out of Sight, Rescue Dawn, Reality Bites. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Anaconda, which stars Paul Rudd and Jack Black, which just came out a few weeks ago. He's not just a movie star. He's also been part of television series like Treme, The White Lotus, Silo, a show I just discovered, or one of my all-time favorite characters, the next-door neighbor in Modern Family, Ronnie LaFontaine. I conducted an oral history interview with Steve Zahn in 2013, and I asked him my favorite first question to ask anybody I interview, even if they're famous. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I grew up in Minnesota. I was just a regular kind of small town suburban kid. I was going to, actually, as a kid I always wanted to be in the military, and I opted for the theater, the obvious next choice. And I started acting. I was at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. I dropped out after a year, after I'd been, cast in the leads there, and I thought, man, I don't want to sit here that long. I went home. I started working professionally in Minneapolis. I then auditioned to schools out east. I got into the American Repertory Theater Institute for Advanced Theatrical Training at Harvard. I was there for 2 years, a little more. Moved to New York. Did theater for years, and then started doing film in like '93. Reality Bites was my first film, and I don't know how many I've done since then, maybe 50 or so, but now it's 2013 and I'm still doing it.
Sitting down with an accomplished professional actor for an oral history interview, you would think we would talk about acting. And we did talk briefly about acting. But the oral history interview had very little to do with his professional acting career, and that was by design. I interviewed Steve as part of a project that the Nunn Center was doing at the time called From Combat to Kentucky, which was interviewing veterans who had served in Iraq or Afghanistan, and after transitioning home, were enrolled as students at the University of Kentucky. We also conducted interviews with student veterans at Eastern Kentucky University, as well as one at Northern Kentucky University. Steve Zahn was not a student veteran. Steve never served in the military. So I think my first job here was to establish why I interviewed Steve for this project. Steve Zahn does not live in Los Angeles. He lives in Kentucky. That usually surprises people. Steve and his family moved here years ago. His wife, Robin Peterman, who is also a creative force, who also acts, directs, but is also a New York Times best-selling author. She grew up here in Lexington, which brought them closer to family. But when I asked Steve the question about why Kentucky, there's something else.
For me, it was the history. I mean, it's beautiful. Like, every state has, aspects of it that are beautiful, but I really enjoyed coming here and spending time and being in a place that was just so kind of entrenched in this kind of old American history. I just thought it was, and to this day, I mean, I'm constantly reading Kentucky history and trying to find those places I'm the guy that stops on the side of the road and drives my family crazy reading the historical markers, Oh, we got to read the other side. Pull up. What does it say? And, my kids are doing it, I brainwashed them into, but that was, and then our family, obviously, her side, and how much easier it would be to raise kids here.
As I mentioned, at the time Steve and I first met, I was directing an oral history project called From Combat to Kentucky, focused on veterans returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan. The project was about documenting military experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, but more so, it was about documenting their transition home and into the classroom. Steve didn't fit the project. However, what I didn't know that first time we met over coffee, he is really, really into military history. On top of that, he's a major supporter of veterans and had recently returned from a trip to Iraq for a sort of USO-style visit with the troops. That was it. Let's conduct an interview about that. I pitched it, and he loved the idea. That said, as an oral historian, I couldn't have a famous actor who was a master at his craft in the chair without asking some biographical questions about growing up, about acting. As the interview unfolded, it became clear that Steve's trip to Iraq didn't come out of nowhere. It was connected to something much deeper. I'm curious because you did mention, interest in the military. Mm-hmm. Talk about, what that meant as a kid.
Yeah, I don't know where that came from. And my dad always thought it was interesting. He was a Lutheran minister, and I grew up in universities. And I remember as a young kid, having college kids that were Vietnam vets at the house. And I was always kind of interested in that. And now I think of it, and these guys were like, in their early 20s, going back to school, and they were combat vets, and they were in our house. And I was always kind of interested in that mysterious, kind of hoping they would tell me something, which they never did. And then we took a family trip. I think this is a common, it was out east to D.C., and we went to Gettysburg for 3 days or 2 days, and I was just blown away on a different level, I think, than most people. I was just completely hypnotized by the place, and that was it. I mean, I remember going to the record store once. I saved up my allowance, and my dad bought a record, and I bought a record, and he bought this Jesus Christ Superstar, and I bought the soundtrack to Patton. We were in line, and he just laughed, going, "That's my son. He's getting Patton." That's what I know every note to that soundtrack. But I was always, I was the kid who, when we got HBO and there were 5 movies on a month and Bridge Too Far was on, I saw it 37 times in 1 month,
As an actor, Steve Zahn has spent most of his career pretending. And like a lot of kids, he played pretend a lot. When Steve talks about playing as a child, what stands out wasn't just fun, fantasy, silliness. There was a layer of depth and seriousness.
And when I played Battle of the Bulge outside in the winter, it wasn't going pow-pow. It was digging a trench and sitting in the cold. And then a neighbor's car would come down the cul-de-sac, and it was a Panzer, And I envisioned what it would be like being that like cold and hearing that come over the hill. And that, for me, it was an emotional connection, which is interesting that my life went into acting and pretending. I thought I wanted to be a soldier, an officer, something that I didn't. I had a different mission,
Later, as a teenager, Steve had another moment that really stayed with him.
I remember one Memorial Day as a kid. I had this book, Letters from Vietnam or something. There was this letter in it that was beautiful. This moving letter about this guy's experience. And I made copies of it. I forgot about this. I made copies of it, like 100 copies. And I went down to Harriet Lake down in Minneapolis, and I handed them out. And I remember people going like, "What is this, religious?" And I was like, "No, just read it." I was in high school. And I remember giving one to a vet, and I knew he was a vet because he had the hat on or what. I don't know. I just knew that he was a vet, and I didn't want to give him one. I thought, "Wow, this is." But then I thought twice. I went back and gave him, and then he ran after me, and he was like, "Thank you." for this. You know, I'm in this group and we can use this and this is a great story. And I think that always stuck with me, kind of.
At one point, Steve seriously considered the Marines. Recruiters came to his football games. But eventually, acting took over, and the career happened. Roles came, and opportunities followed. As I mentioned, we did talk a little bit about acting, his training at Harvard, his epiphany moment when he realized acting was his calling, landing the role in Reality Bites, and the films that followed. But given the interview focus that we had chosen, it did make sense that we gravitated to talking about some of the military roles that he played, as well as some of the roles he wished he'd played. He turned down Band of Brothers and did Joyride instead. There's a little bit of regret in his voice. He would have given just about anything to be part of Saving Private Ryan, but that did not happen. Then came the film Rescue Dawn.
So I was excited mostly when I got Rescue Dawn. I went after that like crazy. About true story about Dieter Dengler and his another pilot, Dwayne Whitney Martin, who was shot down and held captive in Laos early in the war, and it was the only escape actually that I think where somebody escaped and survived, Dieter Dengler. And my character dies in it, but I had to get that movie. I did everything I could to get that movie. I was so excited. I had to lose 40 pounds, and it was easy because I was so into it. When I started doing interviews like this for the movie after, like how much research did you do? And I remember the first person that asked me that, and I said, my whole life. I researched this stuff since I was 10 years old.
Okay, we've now reached that moment in the episode where, just like that same moment in the interview in 2013, I must resist the temptation to spin out and spend the whole time talking about acting. Let's make that intentional turn away from acting, because that wasn't our mission. In July 2008, Steve traveled to Iraq as part of an Ambassadors of Hollywood tour, which was designed to boost troop morale, similar to a USO-style tour during various wars. Actors, models, musicians, comedians, even the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders have regularly taken part in this tradition. This interview documented that visit. It documented service from a different perspective, the perspective of one of the celebrities who went over to connect with and boost the morale of the men and women who were serving. When I asked Steve about how the Ambassadors of Hollywood tour came about, he expressed an initial resistance to go, mainly due to his discomfort going over to simply play the role of famous person.
It's weird. I don't really, when I go around in my day, I don't think of myself as a celebrity. I'm an actor. That's my job. I truly don't, when somebody runs up to me, my instinct is like, is something on fire? Or, why are you running? It's not like, it's because I'm in movies. That's not and I think people think that you think that way, and I really don't. So the point of this is, I didn't feel like when I was asked to go on a trip overseas to Iraq, my instinct was to say no. As much as I wanted to go, Steve, I felt, well, what can I give? I don't want to go there and what? I'm just assuming people know who I am. I don't have an act. I'm not a stand-up comedian. I don't have a show. I would feel like an asshole. And they kept saying, no, you don't get it. Just going means the world. Just you being an American going. I was like, look, I want to go. Trust me. I want to. This would be a dream come true to go into a combat zone. Something I envisioned myself doing my whole life and had to abandon, and now I can do it. They were like, just go. Trust me. And I trusted them. I said, okay. What am I going to be doing? I needed to know the specifics about what I was going to do. Like what am I get up? Will you just hang out? No. What am I going to do? They're like, okay, they get in line, and then they started going, okay, and you're going to have free time, and you're going to, we're going to go. I said, okay, cool. We're going to sign autographs. And I went with these like swimsuit models, and it was like 4 girls who were great. I ended up carrying all their luggage everywhere from Blackhawks. Anyway, should I get into this now?
Let's talk about this.
The tour was through an organization that hosts these types of military tours. They'd bring over bands, musicians, actors, sports figures, all to interact with the troops. So at that point of the interview, I asked about the trip over.
And then in Kuwait, you get off that plane, and you're in that airport, and you step out in that heat, and it's the middle of the night, and you think how weird and how easy it is to go from there to here. Far out. And now I'm in a combat zone. And then you get into the combat zone, and you're like, this incredibly different world that is so, because of modern transportation and technology, it's so close, and yet it's so foreign and weird and in every way.
And then he started telling detailed stories about the trip, and you could see his entire body language change. The energy completely changed in the interview. He was so excited.
And I didn't want to sleep. And my guys were great. I remember at Camp Buka, they were awesome. I just said, let's go talk to guys. Let's go just walk around. Let's go to the armory. Can we go? And I kind of had the run of the place. It was great being a guest like that. And then I started going into, we did a signing right away. It was our kind of, once I did the first signing, I realized how I was relieved that it didn't matter that I had a show. Didn't matter that I had an act or a guitar. It was just taking pictures with these dudes. And you got genuine people with just genuine thanks. And you could tell. They were like, man, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I'm like, dude, really? Busy schedule? Hey, anything. I started doing all these crazy pictures, whatever. I would get real short so they could be tall. I'm just being funny, And then there's this line of like 300 guys, and then you, of course, would have to do it for everyone, And I would. And I would be exhausted after, But I didn't care. But also then being active while you're there, not just sitting back going, I'm the guy. And I would stay up all night, and I'd go in. They're watching a movie, and I'd go in, and we'd sit. It was so fun to walk into a group of guys. I was like, this movie sucks. Why are you watching this? And I would go up and like look for one of mine. Watch this. Like, oh, dude. Oh my God. That was such a rush for me. And then they had a 4th of July kind of take the course and I took the course. There was like a timed thing, and you get, with the M4, and I had beat these guys that were there. The guy that was running it was like, I'm going to put your picture up, with your score, and if you get lower than an actor, it'll be like. So anyway, it was fun, and then they had Friday night fights. I remember 4th of July in Camp Buka. Never had a better 4th. Tell you what, wow, that was something. Mm-hmm. And they had these fights, Friday night fights, and it was just like anybody could fight anybody in a boxing ring. And it was just thug city fighting. People were worn out in 1 minute. And then I decided in a heartbeat, I was like, hey, I need to go fight. I need to fight somebody. And the camp guys were like, yeah, it'd be great if you did. So I found this officer, this woman. I was like, yeah, I hear you kill people with your bare hands. And she's like, yeah, I'm pretty good with that. I said, well, do you want to fight? I said, don't hold back. Don't break my neck. But don't pull the punches, and I'm going to fight you. And so is this dumb telling these specific stupid stories? So she goes, okay, great. And I get the headgear on and everything. And I told my guys, who are like my buddies now, I said, get 15 waters and we're going to line them up on the ring. And then I'm going to go out. I had this whole thing. I'm going to go out and stretch in front of her and like do push-ups, like psych her out. And then when she starts punching me, I'm going to say time out. And then I'm going to come to the ring, and then I'm going to have a big red man chew in when I'm fighting. And I want you to like take my lip and take it out. And then you come in, and the other guy put a big one in, stuffed it in, and then was like, right, go. It was great. It was so impromptu and fun. Man. Camp Bucca was cool.
Throughout his description of his time in Iraq, Steve tells stories of adventure and fun, but also stories of deep emotional and personal connection. Clearly, this trip was a profoundly moving experience for him.
Making people laugh. Making people, that was my mission. And I got there, I was like, I know how to make these people laugh, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to do some crazy stuff. And there were times I remember like, hey, we're eating in the back room. They were still conscious of like, we don't want you to constantly be barraged with these guys. I was like, no, that's why I'm here. I'm going to sit. And there was one of our guides, they were all military. He's like, hey, those guys see at that table, it was a big cap. He said, these guys just came in. They had it tough. I think they lost some people. I was like, oh. They were like, you should go have dinner with them. So I got my tray, and I remember sitting over there. I sat down with these guys who were all dirty, and they were tired, and they could give a shit that I was with them. And it was the only time that I really felt like I have to do a little extra here in order to, and I'm glad I was prepped. They told me, and I sat down and you mind if I said, I could tell right away. We just talked a little bit, and then they asked me something, and I asked them, and this and that, and then they started joking around, and then it got a little lighter, and then, I was, whatever, the little things of like eating his tater tots, replacing it with my broccoli, just going, yeah, I know, it's crazy, isn't it? Stuff like that. And then they got out of their head, and then I started talking about home, and talking about my son, and this and that. And then we went outside, and these guys were busy in this with the whatever. And I went outside, and I hung with them for like an hour and a half, and they showed me their vehicles, and they showed me their stuff, and they were telling me that they lost 2 guys, an IED, like 2 days before, and they just got in. They were in, and it was really powerful. And then I started talking about my son and how, he's just gonna, all these stories, man, he was like, how old is he? I forget, he was like 8, 9, I think Henry was 13. He was like 9, And he ran off, and he grabbed this knife, this amazing folding knife that I looked online. It's like, $500 knife or $400, but those guys get it for that. And he signed it BFC and, to Henry. And then on the other side of the blade, he put keep the peace, and that was it. And to this day, Henry's like, he's like, I told him the story. So these guys were real deal and going through some crap, and I was able to make them feel better. That's it. That's kind of awesome.
It is awesome. Yeah. I never thought much about acting as a process. I just appreciate the magic. Before this interview, I hadn't thought as much about how, in so many ways, acting is about playing pretend. I mentioned earlier that we talked about how, as a child, Steve recalled pretending to be in the military. That takes me to a particular moment in this interview, a moment for me that I reflect on in a book that I just published called Oral History, A Very Short Introduction, which is part of Oxford University Press's Very Short Introduction series. The book is designed to be a concise but comprehensive introduction to oral history. But in Chapter 3, I talk about the art of interviewing. And in that chapter, I tell one of my favorite stories from this interview, my interview with Steve Zahn. It's a story I hadn't really told until the publication of this book. I'm talking about, as an interviewer, the importance of asking good follow-up questions and using an oral history interview to create new dimensions of meaning and understanding, which is a tall order and doesn't always happen. We were talking about Steve first arriving in Iraq. He was describing his first impressions flying in.
It was very loose, it was very strange, and then we got on Blackhawks. I remember in the morning we were waiting for them to come in. You always waited for them, they didn't wait for you. You know, it was a different deal. And these came in and the guys came out and they gave us kind of the safety, which was like, if we go down, you get away from the chopper, we're gonna meet at the back of the chopper, you know, there's weapons. It was just crazy, you know, like, okay, this is more than just, this is how you buckle your seatbelt and, you know, can you run the emergency? It was different, you know, everything was different.
I'm gonna interrupt for a second and make an observation about oral history. Over the course of an interview, interviewers make dozens of split-second decisions about what to follow up on and what not to follow up on.
We got on the Blackhawks and took off, and loud, low. I remember just looking out and seeing camels and just desert, and the other Blackhawk with the other half of our crew, and just being floored, and then them coming over and saying, like, we're in Iraq.
As Steve described first being aware that he was in a combat zone, I drew on our previous conversations about childhood and about acting, and I asked him, did you have a moment on that flight where you realized this wasn't pretend?
Yes, totally. I mean, it was really, this is a real deal.
It was no longer pretend. In the book, I describe that moment in the video recording where you can watch Steve's physical reaction to the question, the reflective pause, the look on his face, his change in posture, followed by placing his hands behind his head, slightly arching his back. Rewatching that moment, you can tell that this was one of those moments in an oral history interview where we move from just asking questions and telling stories to something potentially deeper. I conclude the book chapter by describing the end of the interview, and I'm going to just read a little bit from that passage. After the interview concluded, we took a picture together, because he's famous, and I walked Steve to the door, at which time he paused, turned, and he remarked, and I'll never forget it, quote, "I've done a lot of films over the years, but when I'm gone, this interview is what I want my children and grandchildren to watch," unquote. Ultimately, Steve's interview and this episode are about honoring veterans and their service. Prior to the interview, I had a moment of doubt as to whether we should place this interview, an interview with a civilian who happens to also be a celebrity, in the same archival collection as the men and women who we were interviewing for the From Combat to Kentucky Oral History Project. I asked several of the veterans who participated in the project how they felt. And just like me, they felt that Steve's story, in their archival collection, would only amplify and honor their stories. And now, over a decade since we did this interview, his story has indeed amplified their story. I'm Doug Boyd. Thanks for listening. The Wisdom Project is brought to you by the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History. We're part of the Special Collections Research Center in the University of Kentucky Libraries. The assistant producer on this episode is Megan Hubbard. The interview with Steve Zahn, as well as the incredible interviews from the From Combat to Kentucky Oral History Project, they're all online at KentuckyOralHistory.org. Stay tuned for the next episode of The Wisdom Project.